Hi, today we're going to focus on LT4, which states that you will understand the causes and effects of the major types of erosion: wave, wind, ice, mass movement, and river erosion. So let's start talking about what erosion is. Erosion is the process where a force like wind, water, ice, or gravity will transport soil and sediment from one location to another. It's different from weathering. Last time we talked about weathering, and weathering is when rocks will break down. Erosion is when those rocks will move from one place to another. So this picture shows how the weathered rocks here are moving from here to here. This is erosion because the rocks that were weathered actually moved. Deposition is another really important word that I want you to know for the lesson today. Deposition is when the rocks that got eroded get dropped off. So it's where the rocks settle down. So this picture is perfect for explaining the difference between these three words. Rocks will break up the rock, or weathering will break up the rock. Erosion will move the rocks that were broken up from one place to another. Deposition is the place where the rocks are deposited or get dropped off by erosion. So this is the deposition location. Okay, so try to remember the words erosion and deposition today because we're going to talk about the different types. So why do we care about erosion and deposition? Well, erosion and deposition, first, they allow for different rocks and minerals to get cycled through different parts of the earth. So that's important because living things need different types of minerals, and sometimes rocks will contain those minerals. Also, a really important part is that it reshapes the Earth's surface. Earth is constantly changing because of these forces of erosion and deposition, and it always has changed, and it always will change. So it's a very huge force in shaping the futures and figuring out how our past look like as well. And this can affect the habitats of different animals. So first type of erosion we want to talk about is wave erosion. So wave erosion is made by waves. Let's first talk about where wave erosion occurs. It occurs at shorelines. A shoreline is where the land and water will meet. Waves happen at shorelines and they crash into the land. Every time they crash into land, that energy is going to chip away at some of the land, and that's erosion. And it's going to move that, it's going to weather away at the rocks, and it's going to move those tiny pieces of rocks and sediment to a new location. And waves can form different types of structures depending on the type of rock they're against. So here's some examples of different structures that waves have produced. This is a sea arch. Sea arches form because waves are pounding against this rock, and this part of the rock was softer than the outer part, and therefore it produced a sea arch. This picture represents a headland. So headlands happen when this part of the land contains minerals that are tougher and harder than the minerals that were around this headland area. So it produces these protrusions or these projections that cut into the rock, or cut into the water, and that's a headland. This is a wave-cut terrace. Wave-cut terraces are formed when waves will continually erode away at cliffs, and after thousands and thousands of years, it will form eroded away cliff until it's almost flat. So this is actually not a beach with sand, it's actually a part of a cliff that was flattened down because of waves. And this right here is a sea stack. Sea stacks also form because parts of rocks contain parts that are harder than others, and the softer parts get eroded away first, leaving the single sea stack here. And this sea stack used to be part of this cliff. Okay, now that we talked about erosion, let's talk about deposition. So again, deposition is when the waves will deposit or drop off some of the sand or rocks that eroded away from the cliffs. So waves will carry the sand and rock pieces and deposit them on a shoreline, and when they do, they form a beach. Okay. Now, not all beaches have sand. Sometimes the deposition involves pebbles, like here. Sometimes waves will deposit little pieces of lava rock, and that's why this beach has really, really dark rocks and sand.
Now we're going to go into the second type of erosion, which is wind erosion. So wind erosion is when wind will transport pieces of rock from one place to another. So it involves three different processes. The first one is called saltation. That's the skipping and bouncing movement of sand-sized particles. So saltation is when little pieces of rock will bounce across different areas because of the wind. Deflation is when really fine pieces of sediment get removed and leaving behind larger rocks. So this picture shows deflation. You can see there's lots of large pieces of rocks left behind, and the wind is actually blowing the really fine pieces of sand to another location. And lastly, abrasion is the wearing away of rock surfaces by the wind blowing rock or sand particles on the rock. So the wind will blow little sand particles on this rock and actually remove some of the rock and will transport that rock to another location. So let's talk about deposition for wind. So in wind deposition, the winds will drop off the sand that it was eroding in another location. So of course, winds will eventually slow down, and when they slow down, it's gonna just drop off the sand wherever it slows down. And it forms these formations called sand dunes. Now let's talk about another type of erosion called ice erosion. It's also called glacial erosion because it involves glaciers. A glacier, this is a picture, is a huge mountain of ice. Glaciers usually form in polar regions and places where snow can pile up year after year. And glaciers move. Kind of hard to believe, but they are very huge pieces of ice that move very slowly. They move because of the pull of gravity, and when glaciers move, they will weather the rocks around them. So here's a picture of what happened to the land after a glacier moved. This area was reshaped because of the glacier. Now, when glaciers move, they will weather the rock, and they will pick up little pieces of rock with them and transport them to a new location. And that's called ice deposition. So in ice deposition, little pieces of rock will stick on the bottom of the glacier and drop them off as they melt down in another location. Okay, now let's talk about another type of erosion, major type of erosion, stream and river erosion. Now, let's first talk about this word gradient. Gradient means how high a river is. The higher the gradient, so the higher the river is, or the higher the angle of the river is, the faster the water will flow. And the faster the water, the more erosion occurs. Whereas if a river has a low gradient, it's probably very slow and it won't pick up as many rocks as a river with a high gradient. The word discharge refers to the amount of water that a river can carry. So the larger the discharge, that means the more water there is, the more erosion can occur. So this picture shows the same river. This river is during a normal day, sunny day, and you can see the discharge is not that much. But on a rainy day, there's going to be an increase in the amount of water, so the discharge is going to increase. And you can see right here, because there's so much more water, there's more force involved, and that's going to cause more erosion to occur in this river. Load is the vocabulary word that relates to the rocks and sediment that's carried by the stream. So in every river, there's some particles of rocks and sand and sediment that are being washed away by the force of the river, and that's the load. The faster the river, the faster the stream, the more load it can carry and the more erosion can occur. So, for example, you can see there's different types of loads. There's some loads that are larger, we call that the bed load, and we have some loads that are so small that they're dissolved in the water, we call that dissolved load. The more force, the more there is in the river, the more we can move these larger bed loads. And if we can move these larger bed loads, those bed loads will probably hit other rocks and cause erosion. And that's how some of these formations in land, this river is carving right through a mountain. And this formed after thousands of years, but it probably formed because there was enough force to carve through that mountain. Now let's talk about deposition with streams and rivers. So deposition, remember, is when little pieces of rocks and sediment get dropped off. For rivers, sediment gets dropped off when the rivers slow down. Rivers usually slow down in areas where the rivers end, and rivers end where the ocean starts. So you can see this picture shows a delta. A delta is an area where a river meets the ocean, and that's where rivers will actually dump off their sediment and mud, and that's why you can see there's lots of mud here in this delta. Another type of deposition by streams and rivers is alluvial fan. Alluvial fans are slightly different from deltas in that they usually happen on dry land. So you can see for deltas, they feed right into the ocean, but for alluvial fans, they're usually stopping right on land. So it's the same, it's very similar to a delta, except the deposit is usually, usually on the bottom of a mountain where the stream actually slows down because of the change in the angle of the slope. Another type of river deposition is a floodplain. So sometimes when it rains, the rivers will overflow with water, and when it overflows with water, it will actually carry some of the sediment from the river into an area next to it, and that's a floodplain. And you can see in this picture, here's the river, and right next to it is a floodplain. And floodplains are great because it carries some of the rich sediment from the river into the land, and a lot of farms, it's great for farming because it has really rich soil and sediment from the river. Lastly, let's talk about the erosion and deposition by mass movement. So mass movement is a movement of any material like rock and soil or snow down a slope by the force of gravity. So I'm just going to briefly mention some of the major types of mass movement. The first one is rockfall. That's just when loose rocks fall down a slope, and that's going to, cause some erosion of rock. Landslides are, when there's a sudden movement of land, plants, and animals due to heavy rains or deforestation, and that usually causes erosion of sides of cliffs and mountains, and that's going to deposit them on the bottom of the mountain. Mud flows are similar to landslides, except they involve the movement of a large mass of mud, and also they move right down a slope. And finally, creep is the slow movement of rocks and soil downhill, and it's also caused by loose dirt and from plants and burrowing animals.